Step out of the vehicle before I make this difficult. The voice sliced through the rain like cold steel. Naomi Carter kept both hands on the steering wheel as red and blue lights flashed across the wet Texas highway, reflecting off her windshield in restless waves. Her old gray sedan hummed quietly beneath the storm, while Officer Brad Collins stood outside her driver's window, one hand resting near his belt, the other gripping a flashlight hard enough to make his knuckles pale beneath the beam. The highway was nearly empty at 11:43 p.m., just a few distant headlights cutting through the dark every now and then, but somehow the silence felt crowded, heavy, like the night itself was watching. Naomi slowly lowered her window 2 inches. Rain sprayed inside immediately, cold against her cheek. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked calmly. Collins leaned closer, his flashlight sweeping across her face, then the back seat, then the floorboards. He didn't answer the question. License and registration. Naomi reached carefully into her purse, every movement measured, controlled. She had done this dance before. Too many times. The flashlight paused on her hands. "Slow," Collins muttered. "I said slow." Naomi handed him the documents without another word. Collins looked at the address, then back at her face. "You coming from somewhere?" "Work." "What kind of work?" Naomi hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Long shift," she replied. Collins gave a dry smile that never reached his eyes. "That's not what I asked." Rain tapped steadily against the roof, while another patrol car rolled up behind Collins' cruiser. Officer Mark Ellison stepped out, younger, quieter, adjusting his jacket against the wind. Collins walked back toward him with Naomi's ID in hand. Through the side mirror, Naomi could see them talking beneath the flashing lights. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the body language immediately. The glance back at her car, the smirk, the assumption. Collins returned a minute later, slower this time. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Naomi looked straight ahead. "Is there a reason?" Collins' expression tightened. "You refusing a lawful order?" "I'm asking what probable cause you have." The rain grew harder. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the flat Texas sky. Ellison shifted uneasily near the cruiser while Collins stared down at Naomi through the cracked window. "Funny thing about people who ask too many questions," Collins said quietly. "Usually means they're hiding something." Naomi felt her pulse steady instead of rise. That calmness came from years of training, years of learning how fear could cloud judgment in exactly the wrong moment. Collins tapped the roof of her sedan twice. "Step out." Slowly, Naomi opened the door and stood beneath the cold rain. Her gray hoodie darkened almost instantly, water sliding down the sleeves while headlights painted long reflections across the pavement. Collins circled the car once, taking his time. "You got anything illegal in there?" "No drugs. No weapons. No." Collins suddenly stopped beside the back door and looked toward Ellison. "Body cam running?" Ellison touched the device clipped to his chest. "Yeah." Collins stared at him for a second too long. "Battery issues again?" Ellison hesitated. Naomi noticed it immediately. The pause. The uncertainty. Then Ellison reached toward the camera. A soft click disappeared beneath the rain. Naomi slowly turned her eyes toward him. And for the first time that night, Officer Mark Ellison couldn't hold her gaze. Officer Brad Collins moved with the confidence of a man who had done this too many times before. His boots splashed through shallow rainwater as he walked toward Naomi's sedan, shining his flashlight into every corner like he already expected to find something. Naomi stood beside the driver's door with her hands visible, cold rain dripping from the edge of her sleeves. Behind her, 18-wheelers roared down the highway in bursts of white light and diesel thunder, but out here on the shoulder, the world felt strangely isolated, trapped inside flashing patrol lights and wet asphalt. Collins opened the back door of her car without asking again. "You live alone?" he asked casually while searching beneath a blanket in the back seat. Naomi did not answer immediately. "That relevant to the traffic stop?" Collins chuckled under his breath. "Depends what we find." Officer Mark Ellison stayed near the cruiser, arms folded tightly against the rain. Naomi noticed the way he kept glancing between Collins and the disabled body camera clipped to his chest. Nervous? Guilty? Or maybe both? Collins searched longer than necessary, opening compartments, shifting papers, checking beneath the seats. Finally, he straightened and looked back toward Naomi. "You seem pretty calm." Naomi met his eyes without blinking. "Should I be nervous?" Collins stepped closer, lowering his voice. Usually people get nervous when they know they are in trouble. Naomi could smell coffee on his breath mixed with rain and cigarette smoke. I know my rights, she said quietly. Something about those words changed the air between them. Collins' jaw tightened almost instantly. Men like him hated calm people. Hated confidence even more. Especially when it came from someone they had already decided was beneath them. He walked back toward his cruiser for a moment, then returned holding a small flashlight in one hand and latex gloves in the other. Mind if I take another look? He asked, though his tone made it clear he did not care about the answer. Naomi watched him crouch near the driver's seat. The rain softened briefly, leaving only the distant hum of highway traffic and the faint crackle of police radio chatter floating through the night air. Then Collins suddenly froze. Well now, he muttered. He reached beneath the seat slowly before standing up with a small plastic bag pinched between his fingers. White powder. Naomi stared at it in silence. Officer Ellison looked up sharply from beside the cruiser. Even from several feet away, Naomi saw confusion flash across his face for half a second. Collins held the bag higher beneath the flashing lights. Looks like we found something after all. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice stayed level. That is not mine. Collins smiled for the first time all night. Funny how everybody says that. Ellison stepped forward carefully. Brad. Collins cut him off without looking away from Naomi. Call it in. The younger officer hesitated. Again, Naomi could almost hear the war happening inside his head. Procedure versus loyalty. Truth versus fear. Finally, Ellison reached for the radio at his shoulder. Possible narcotics possession, he said quietly. Collins moved behind Naomi with cold efficiency. Turn around. Naomi obeyed slowly, rain sliding down her face while headlights swept across the highway behind them. The metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, tighter than necessary, but still controlled enough to stay just inside department policy. Collins leaned closer near her ear. You should have stayed home tonight. Naomi looked out at the dark highway stretching endlessly into the storm. Her breathing remained steady, calm, measured. Then, after several seconds of silence, she spoke in a voice so quiet that only the two officers could hear it. Officer Ellison, she said softly, before this goes any further, you may want to check the inside pocket of my jacket. Rainwater dripped steadily from Naomi Carter's sleeves onto the dark pavement, while Officer Mark Ellison stared at her like he was trying to understand whether she was bluffing or warning him. The highway lights reflected across her face in pulses of blue and red, cold and steady, but her expression never changed. Officer Brad Collins gave a short laugh beside her. Do not tell me she thinks this is some kind of movie. Naomi ignored him completely. Her eyes stayed on Ellison. Inside left pocket, she repeated quietly. The younger officer hesitated. Collins noticed immediately. Mark. His voice sharpened. Do not play games. Search the vehicle again. But Ellison did not move right away. Something about Naomi's calmness had started eating at him from the moment the body camera clicked off. Most people panicked by now. Most people begged, argued, cried, or shouted about injustice into the rain. Naomi had done none of that. She stood there handcuffed beneath the storm with the stillness of someone who already knew how the night would end. Ellison stepped closer cautiously. What is in the pocket? Naomi looked at him for a long second before answering. Something that is going to make both of you rethink every decision you made in the last 10 minutes. Collins rolled his eyes. Enough. He grabbed Naomi's shoulder roughly enough to reposition her toward the cruiser. You are under arrest for possession and obstruction. Naomi finally turned her head slightly toward him. You planted evidence in a federal investigation. The words landed harder than the thunder rolling above them. Collins froze for half a second, then smirked again. Federal investigation? He repeated. Lady, you drive a 12-year-old sedan with a broken tail light. Naomi said nothing. The rain softened into mist around them, while passing headlights swept across the roadside grass in pale flashes. Ellison swallowed hard before slowly reaching toward Naomi's jacket pocket. Collins noticed immediately. Mark, if she is lying, we lose 30 seconds. Ellison muttered quietly. If she is not, he did not finish the sentence. Naomi remained perfectly still as Ellison carefully opened the inside pocket of her rain-soaked jacket. His fingers brushed against leather. Then he pulled out a black credential wallet folded tight beneath the fabric. Collins scoffed at first. Probably fake. But Ellison opened it anyway. The moment the badge caught the flashing patrol lights, the entire atmosphere changed. Gold. Federal Seal. Drug Enforcement Administration. Special Agent Naomi Carter. Ellison's face lost all color. The rain suddenly sounded louder against the pavement, louder against the cruisers, louder against the empty Texas highway stretching into darkness behind them. Collins stared at the badge without blinking. That is not possible. Naomi's voice stayed calm. Actually, Officer Collins, it is very possible. Ellison looked between the badge and the woman standing handcuffed in front of him. The calmness made sense now. The careful movements. The controlled breathing. The way she watched everything without reacting emotionally. This was not fear. It was discipline. Collins stepped closer, lowering his voice. You are telling me you are DEA? Naomi slowly turned toward him as much as the cuffs allowed. Undercover Narcotics Division. 8 months active. Collins' jaw tightened visibly. You expect us to believe that? Naomi looked directly into his eyes for the first time since the stop began. No, she said softly. I expected you to leave your body cameras on. Silence swallowed the roadside. Even the radio chatter from the cruiser seemed distant now. Then Naomi nodded once toward the dashboard of her sedan. You might also want to know, she continued quietly, that my vehicle has been transmitting audio to a federal server since the moment your lights came on behind me. Officer Brad Collins suddenly looked very aware of the rain falling around him. Officer Brad Collins took one slow step backward as the rain continued falling around them in silver streaks beneath the patrol lights. For the first time all night, the confidence in his face cracked. Not completely. Just enough for Naomi Carter to see the panic beginning underneath. Officer Mark Ellison still held the DEA credentials in trembling hands, staring down at the badge like it might suddenly disappear if he blinked hard enough. Brad, he muttered quietly. Collins snapped his eyes toward him. Give me that. Ellison hesitated before handing over the credential wallet. Collins opened it himself this time, flipping through the identification card, federal seals, authorization signatures, everything impossible to fake under a roadside flashlight. The storm seemed quieter now, replaced by the low electrical hum of flashing lights and distant highway tires hissing across wet pavement. Naomi stood motionless with her hands cuffed behind her back, rainwater sliding down her forehead, without her bothering to wipe it away. Collins looked up slowly. You said this vehicle is transmitting? Naomi nodded once. Audio, location, and timestamp data. Collins forced a laugh that sounded thin even to himself. That does not prove anything. No, Naomi replied calmly. But the narcotics task force listening live probably helps. Ellison's face turned pale again. He looked instinctively toward the dark tree line beyond the highway shoulder, as if federal agents might suddenly emerge from the storm itself. Collins immediately caught the look. Nobody is coming, he snapped. But Naomi noticed something important in his voice now. He was no longer speaking to her. He was trying to convince himself. A sharp burst of static cracked through the patrol cruiser radio. Dispatch calling for status update. Collins ignored it completely. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his jaw while he stared at Naomi with growing anger. You set this up. Naomi finally allowed herself the smallest shift in expression. Not a smile. Just disappointment. No, Officer Collins. You set this up the second you turned off your cameras. The younger officer looked down at the wet pavement beneath his boots. Naomi could almost see the moment his loyalty started breaking apart under the weight of what had happened. He replayed every second in his mind now. The stop, the search, the planted evidence, the camera shutting off, federal transmission, DEA credentials. His breathing grew shallow. Collins suddenly stepped closer toward Naomi again, lowering his voice into something dangerous and desperate. If you are really federal, then why are you driving around alone in the middle of nowhere? Naomi looked at him steadily. Because corrupt officers get comfortable on empty roads. Thunder rolled low above them again. Collins' jaw tightened so hard the muscles flickered beneath his skin. You have no proof I planted anything. Naomi tilted her head slightly toward the disabled body camera clipped to Ellison's chest. You already destroyed the only thing that might have helped you. Silence followed. Heavy. Suffocating. Then another sound appeared in the distance. Tires. Multiple vehicles moving fast across wet highway pavement. Ellison turned first. Headlights emerged through the rain far down the road. Bright white beams cutting through darkness in a long line. One SUV. Then another. Then a third. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just black vehicles moving with controlled purpose through the storm. Collins stared at them without breathing. Naomi finally exhaled slowly for the first time all night. There they are, she said quietly. The SUVs pulled onto the shoulder one after another, tires crunching against wet gravel. Doors opened almost immediately. Men and women in dark federal jackets stepped out beneath the rain, there. Movements calm and practiced. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. They did not need to. The authority was already there. One older agent approached first, silver hair damp from the storm, eyes locked directly on Naomi. Then he noticed the handcuffs. His expression changed instantly. "Special Agent Carter," he said carefully. "Are you injured?" Naomi shook her head once. "No, sir." The older agent's eyes slowly moved toward Officer Brad Collins. "Good," he replied. Because this traffic stop just became a very different investigation. The cold metal cuffs finally clicked open beneath the rain-soaked highway lights, and Naomi Carter slowly rubbed her wrists as one of the federal agents stepped between her and Officer Brad Collins. The older agent introduced himself quietly. Supervisory Agent Daniel Mercer. His calm voice carried the kind of authority that did not need volume to command attention. Around them, the federal team moved with silent precision, documenting the scene, photographing the patrol vehicles, securing the evidence bag Collins had supposedly discovered beneath Naomi's seat. Nobody looked rushed. Nobody looked surprised. Like they had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. Collins tried to regain control of the situation. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, rain dripping from his short blonde hair onto his collar. "We conducted a lawful traffic stop." Mercer looked at him without expression. "You disabled body cameras during a narcotics search." Collins swallowed hard. "Technical issue." Mercer glanced toward Officer Mark Ellison. "Both cameras." Ellison stood frozen beside the cruiser, water soaking through his uniform while guilt spread visibly across his face. He looked exhausted suddenly, older than he had 30 minutes ago. Collins shot him a warning look, but the younger officer could barely meet anyone's eyes anymore. Naomi watched quietly from beside her sedan while one federal agent opened a hard case inside the nearest SUV. A laptop screen flickered alive beneath the rain shield. Audio waveforms stretched across the monitor. Timestamps. GPS tracking. Everything recorded from the moment Collins' lights first appeared behind her vehicle. Mercer turned slightly toward Naomi. "Transmission stayed stable the entire time?" "Yes, sir," she answered calmly. Full roadside interaction uploaded live. Collins immediately interrupted. "You cannot record officers without consent." Mercer finally looked irritated. "Federal surveillance warrants work differently than your department rumors, Officer Collins." The words landed like a door slamming shut. Nearby, another agent carefully placed the narcotics bag into a sealed evidence container. He examined it beneath a flashlight before speaking quietly toward Mercer. "No rain exposure." Mercer nodded once. "Interesting." Collins stared at the evidence bag in silence. Everyone understood what that meant. The plastic should have been wet after sitting beneath a leaking sedan seat during a thunderstorm. But it was dry. Perfectly dry. Naomi noticed the exact moment Collins realized the detail had destroyed him. His shoulders dropped slightly beneath the rain. Tiny. Almost invisible. But enough. Officer Ellison suddenly spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Brad," his voice cracked. Collins turned sharply. "Do not." But Ellison was already unraveling beneath the pressure. "I told you we should have left the cameras running." Mercer's eyes shifted immediately toward him. "Officer Ellison," he said carefully, "this is your opportunity to decide whether you are part of corruption or part of the investigation." The rain fell harder again, bouncing off the highway shoulder in silver ripples beneath the flashing lights. Ellison looked down at his trembling hands. "He said she fit the profile," he admitted quietly. "He said nobody would question it." Collins exploded instantly. "Watch your mouth." But the panic in his voice only made things worse now. The younger officer shook his head slowly. This was not the first stop either. Silence followed. Heavy and dangerous. Mercer exchanged a glance with Naomi. She already knew. The task force had spent months tracking complaints connected to isolated highway stops along this exact route. Missing evidence. Unreported cash seizures. Arrest records that never fully matched body camera footage. Naomi had volunteered for the undercover operation herself after noticing one repeated detail in every internal complaint. Most victims were black drivers traveling alone at night. Collins suddenly looked toward the dark highway like he was calculating escape routes in his head, but there was nowhere left to run now. Federal SUVs blocked both sides of the shoulder. The storm boxed everything else in. Naomi stepped forward slowly, rain dripping from the edge of her hood, while Collins stared at her with disbelief and anger twisting together inside his expression. "You profiled me before you even saw my license," she said quietly. Collins said nothing, because for the first time all night, he understood the truth. The woman he thought was powerless had been watching him from the very beginning. The storm finally began to weaken just after midnight, but the tension along the roadside only grew heavier. Rainwater still clung to the highway in shimmering pools beneath the flashing lights, while federal agents moved quietly between vehicles, collecting statements, logging evidence, and photographing every inch of the scene. Naomi Carter stood near the hood of her gray sedan with a thermal blanket draped loosely over her shoulders, though she barely seemed to notice the cold anymore. Her eyes stayed fixed on Officer Brad Collins. He no longer looked like the confident man who had walked up to her window less than an hour earlier. The arrogance was gone now, washed away by rain and reality. He stood beside his cruiser in silence while another federal agent documented the disabled body camera clipped to Officer Mark Ellison's uniform. "I never touched the evidence," Collins muttered suddenly, almost to himself. Supervisory Agent Daniel Mercer looked up from his notes. "That is interesting," he replied calmly. "Because nobody asked yet." Collins' mouth tightened immediately. Across the shoulder, Ellison sat on the rear bumper of a federal SUV with his elbows resting on his knees, soaked uniform clinging to him beneath the cold wind. He looked hollow, like the weight of the night had finally settled into his bones. Naomi watched him quietly for several seconds. Before walking over, the gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes. Ellison looked up as she approached, shame written across his face before he even spoke. "I should have stopped it," he admitted quietly. Naomi folded her arms against the cold. "Then why did you not?" Ellison stared out toward the empty highway. "Because after a while," he hesitated, "you start convincing yourself it is normal." The words hung in the damp night air heavier than the storm clouds above them. Naomi said nothing at first. She had heard versions of that sentence before during investigations. Good people staying silent because silence felt safer than conflict, safer than truth. Ellison rubbed rainwater from his forehead. The complaints always disappeared. Internal affairs never pushed. Brad said nobody cared enough to look deeper. Naomi glanced back toward Collins standing beneath the patrol lights. "People cared," she said softly. "They just were not being heard." Nearby, one of the federal agents closed a laptop after reviewing the live transmission logs from Naomi's vehicle. Mercer approached slowly with the device tucked beneath one arm. "Audio confirms probable cause violations, tampering concerns, and evidence inconsistencies," he said evenly. Collins immediately straightened. "You are twisting context." Mercer barely reacted. Context usually improves when cameras stay on. Collins looked away. The older agent then turned toward Naomi. "Headquarters already notified the district office. This stop is going to trigger review of every arrest tied to Collins over the last 4 years." Naomi exhaled slowly. For years, how many drivers had stood on this same shoulder believing nobody would ever believe them? How many had driven away humiliated, frightened, or carrying charges that never should have existed in the first place? The thought settled heavily inside her chest. A gust of cold wind swept across the highway, carrying the distant smell of wet asphalt and diesel fuel. Collins suddenly looked toward Naomi again. There was anger in his face still, but something else had appeared beneath it now. Fear. Real fear. "You set me up," he repeated weakly. Naomi met his stare calmly. "No, Officer Collins. I gave you a chance to do the right thing the moment I asked if your camera was running." Silence followed again, the kind that forces people to hear themselves clearly for the first time. Officer Ellison lowered his eyes toward the pavement. Mercer closed his notebook with a quiet snap. Somewhere down the highway, another truck passed beneath the fading storm clouds, headlights stretching briefly across the roadside before disappearing back into darkness. Naomi looked out at the empty road ahead of her and finally allowed herself one slow breath of relief. Not victory. Relief. Because tonight was never about revenge. It was about making sure the next driver on this highway would not have to feel powerless beneath flashing lights in the middle of the rain. By 1:30 in the morning, the rain had finally stopped completely, leaving the Texas highway wrapped in a damp silver haze beneath rows of flashing emergency lights. Water still dripped from the edges of patrol cars and federal SUVs, while the smell of wet asphalt lingered in the cool night air. Naomi Carter stood beside her sedan watching federal agents finish processing the scene, her expression calm but distant, like her mind was already carrying the weight of everything that would happen after tonight. Officer Brad Collins sat alone in the back seat of a dark SUV now, separated from everyone else by tinted glass and silence. He stared forward without moving, the reflection of red and blue lights sliding endlessly across his face like a reminder he could not escape. A few yards away, Officer Mark Ellison quietly signed an initial statement beneath the glow of a portable floodlight. His hand still shook slightly every time he reached for the pen. Supervisory Agent Daniel Mercer approached Naomi holding 2 paper coffee cups. Steam curled upward into the cold air between them. "You should probably drink something warm," he said. Naomi accepted the cup with a small nod. The coffee tasted bitter and overbrewed, but the heat grounded her again after hours spent standing in rain and tension. Mercer leaned beside her against the hood of the sedan. "You did good tonight." Naomi stared out, toward the dark highway stretching beyond the flashing lights. It should not take an undercover operation to prove somebody deserves fair treatment during a traffic stop. Mercer did not answer immediately because there was nothing simple enough to say back to that. The distant hum of engines filled the silence for several seconds before Naomi finally spoke again. "When Collins looked at me tonight, he already had the story written in his head before I even rolled the window down." Mercer glanced toward the SUV holding Collins inside. "People like him stop seeing individuals after a while," he said quietly. "They only see assumptions." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from her coffee cup. "And assumptions become power if nobody challenges them." Nearby, one federal agent approached carrying a tablet. "We pulled archived complaints connected to Collins," she informed Mercer. 17 traffic stops flagged over the last 4 years. Most involved black drivers traveling alone after dark. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. 17 documented complaints, which probably meant many more people never reported anything at all. Mercer thanked the agent quietly before she walked away again. The older man sighed heavily. Internal Affairs ignored patterns for years. Naomi looked toward him carefully. Because patterns are easy to ignore when the victims are invisible. Those words stayed hanging in the cold night air long after she said them. Mercer studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You know headquarters is going to want interviews. Press inquiries too." Naomi gave a faint, tired smile. "I did not volunteer for this operation to become a headline." In the distance, Officer Ellison slowly approached them, his soaked uniform jacket hanging open now beneath the cooling wind. He stopped several feet away, uncertain whether he even deserved to stand near her after what happened. Naomi looked at him quietly. Ellison swallowed hard. "I kept thinking about what you said earlier," he admitted. "About cameras." Naomi waited. He lowered his eyes toward the pavement. "The truth is, I knew turning them off was wrong before I even touched the button." His voice cracked slightly beneath the weight of the confession. "I just told myself it was easier not to argue." Naomi studied him carefully for a long moment before answering. "That is how corruption survives," she said softly. "Not always through cruelty. Sometimes through silence." Ellison nodded slowly, ashamed. Another long silence settled over the roadside while dawn remained hours away beyond the clouds. The flashing lights reflected across puddles beside the highway like broken pieces of color scattered through darkness. Naomi pulled the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked once more toward the SUV where Collins sat alone. Earlier that night, he had seen her as powerless. Just another black woman driving alone on an empty road. But now the entire highway felt different somehow. Quieter. Honest. Like the storm had finally washed something ugly into the light where nobody could pretend not to see it anymore. The first pale traces of dawn began appearing beyond the horizon just after 4 in the morning, turning the clouds above the Texas highway from charcoal gray into faded silver. Most of the rainwater had finally drained from the shoulder, leaving only scattered puddles reflecting the glow of emergency lights that were now beginning to dim one by one. Federal agents continued packing equipment into SUVs while tow trucks arrived in the distance for the patrol vehicles involved in the investigation. The storm was over, but nobody at the scene looked untouched by it. Naomi Carter sat quietly on the open tailgate of a federal SUV, warming her hands around a second cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Her hoodie had dried stiff from rain and long hours in the cold air, but she barely noticed anymore. Exhaustion rested behind her eyes now, heavier than anything else. Supervisory Agent Daniel Mercer stood nearby reviewing preliminary reports with two investigators, while Officer Mark Ellison remained seated alone near the guardrail, staring out toward the empty highway without speaking. Officer Brad Collins had not said another word in almost an hour. Naomi glanced toward the SUV holding him and felt something unexpected settle inside her chest. Not satisfaction, sadness. Because corruption never really looked dramatic up close. It looked ordinary, tired, human. That was what made it dangerous. Mercer eventually walked over holding a folder beneath one arm. District Command already suspended Collins pending federal charges, he informed her quietly. Naomi nodded once. And Ellison? Mercer looked back toward the younger officer sitting alone near the roadside, cooperating fully. Naomi stayed silent for a moment. He made a terrible choice tonight, Mercer added carefully. But he also stopped lying once it mattered. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup in her hands. Steam no longer rose from it. Sometimes people forget courage does not start in comfortable moments, she said softly. Nearby, Ellison slowly stood and approached them again, his posture hesitant beneath the cold dawn wind. He looked exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. Like the version of himself he believed in had cracked apart somewhere between turning off that camera and watching federal agents step out of the storm. He stopped several feet from Naomi. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Naomi looked up at him. You do. Ellison swallowed hard. When Collins pulled you over, I already knew how the stop was going to go before either of us even spoke to you. His voice shook slightly, and I still stood there. The highway remained silent around them except for distant engines humming far off in the early morning dark. Naomi studied him carefully before answering. What matters now is whether you stand differently next time. Ellison lowered his head slowly. Mercer watched the exchange without interrupting. There was no dramatic speech left to give anymore. No courtroom moment. No shouting. Just the quiet aftermath of choices finally exposed beneath daylight. A cold breeze swept across the roadside as another federal SUV pulled away, its tires hissing softly against damp pavement. Naomi stood from the tailgate and walked toward her sedan while agents finished removing evidence markers around it. The old gray car looked strangely small now beneath the growing morning light. Ordinary. Invisible. Exactly the reason the operation had worked. Mercer followed beside her. You know this case is going national once reports hit the media. Naomi opened the driver's door slowly. Maybe that is necessary. Mercer nodded once. People trust systems easier than they trust individuals. Naomi looked back toward the highway where flashing lights were finally disappearing one by one into dawn. That is the problem, she said quietly. Systems are still made of people. Mercer did not respond because there was nothing untrue in those words. Naomi slid into the driver's seat and rested her hands on the steering wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. Across the shoulder, Officer Mark Ellison watched silently while federal agents escorted Brad Collins toward another waiting vehicle. Collins briefly lifted his eyes toward Naomi one last time, but she did not look away this time. She simply held his gaze calmly, without hatred, without triumph. Just truth. Then she pulled onto the empty highway and drove into the first light of morning while the flashing lights behind her slowly disappeared into silence. 3 weeks later, the stretch of Texas highway where everything happened looked completely ordinary again. The storm was gone. The flashing lights were gone. Cars moved through the night without slowing down, headlights cutting across the empty road in quiet streams of white and gold. Most people driving there would never know how close that roadside had come to swallowing another innocent person into silence. Naomi Carter stood alone beside a gas station parking lot just off the interstate, coffee warming her hands against the cool evening air while she watched 18-wheelers roll past beneath fading sunset light. The world had moved on quickly. News channels covered the investigation for days before chasing newer headlines. Internal reviews spread through multiple departments. Old complaints connected to Brad Collins were reopened one by one. Some charges against former drivers were already being dismissed. Others were still under investigation. But Naomi understood something most people did not. Justice rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it moved quietly, slowly, like dawn creeping over a dark highway 1 inch at a time. Her phone buzzed softly in her jacket pocket. A message from Supervisory Agent Daniel Mercer. Court-approved expanded review this morning. More officers coming forward. Naomi read the text twice before locking the screen again. Nearby, the gas station clerk stepped outside to sweep rain dust from the sidewalk, completely unaware that the woman standing beside pump number 6 had spent the last month changing the course of multiple investigations across the state. Naomi preferred it that way. She had never wanted recognition, only truth. A dark sedan suddenly pulled into the station lot and parked several spaces away. Officer Mark Ellison stepped out slowly, wearing plain clothes instead of a uniform now. He looked different somehow. Lighter. Nervous too. Naomi watched quietly as he approached. "I was not sure you would come," she admitted. Ellison gave a small, tired smile. "I almost did not." He held a folded envelope carefully in one hand. "Final resignation papers," he explained. "Turned them in this morning." Naomi studied his face for a long moment. "How does it feel?" Ellison looked toward the highway where headlights blurred past in the distance. "Honest," he said quietly. The wind moved softly between them, carrying the smell of gasoline, asphalt, and dry evening air. Ellison lowered his eyes briefly. "I keep thinking about that night." Naomi remained silent. "Not the investigation," he clarified softly. "The moment you asked whether my camera was running." He shook his head slowly. "I realized later you were giving me one last chance to decide who I wanted to be." Naomi looked down into her coffee cup where the last traces of steam curled upward into the cooling night. "Everybody gets moments like that," she said quietly. "Most people just do not realize it until afterward." Ellison nodded slowly. "You could have destroyed me completely." Naomi finally looked at him directly. "No," she answered softly. "Your choices almost did that." The words were not cruel, just true. And somehow that truth hurt more than anger ever could. Across the highway, a billboard flickered beneath the darkening sky while traffic rushed endlessly forward beneath it. People heading home. People chasing work. Families traveling through the night without knowing how fragile trust could become once fear and power mixed together in the wrong hands. Ellison slipped the resignation envelope into his jacket pocket and gave Naomi a quiet nod. "For what it is worth," he said carefully, "I am glad it was you in that car that night." Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. Ellison looked toward the highway again. Because somebody had to stop pretending everything was fine. Silence settled gently between them after that. Not awkward, not heavy, just honest. Naomi finished the last sip of coffee and tossed the empty cup into a nearby trash bin before walking back toward her old gray sedan. The same car, the same quiet engine, the same invisible appearance that made people underestimate her every single day. She paused beside the driver's door and glanced once more toward the endless highway stretching beneath the evening sky. Then she got in, started the engine, and disappeared into the flow of headlights while somewhere far behind her, the last traces of corruption were finally beginning to come into the light.